Ever stop and think about why you believe what you do politically? Was it something your parents always said? Something you saw in the news? And how do your own personal views fit into the huge, sometimes messy picture of public opinion in America? Well, today we're going to try and figure that out. We're creating a kind of political self-portrait to see how our views get formed, how they're measured, and what we can do with them. Here's how we're going to build this portrait piece by piece. First, we'll look at the incredible diversity of the American mosaic. That's the backdrop for everything. Then, we're going to turn inward and find our own political compass. After that, we'll see how pollsters actually take the pulse of the public. And finally, we'll get into how you can make your mark on the political world. So let's just start with a number, 40%. What in the world could that be? Well, get this. Shortly after the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, was passed, one of the biggest policy debates of our time, a full 40% of Americans believed it created death panels and gave insurance to undocumented immigrants, neither of which was true. And that number, right there, gets to the heart of the puzzle we're tackling today. If so many people can be mistaken about the facts on really big issues, how do we even form our opinions in the first place? And the even bigger question, how does a democracy, which is supposed to be guided by the will of the people, actually work? To even begin to answer that, we have to start with the context. So, part one, the American mosaic. Think of this as the giant, diverse canvas on which all of our individual political beliefs are painted. America has, of course, always been a nation of immigrants. But who those immigrants are has changed. A lot. You can really see our history as three great waves. The first was mostly folks from Northwestern Europe. The second brought a whole new group from Southern and Eastern Europe. But that third wave, the one that started around the 1960s and continues today, that's a fundamental shift, with most new Americans now coming from Latin America and Asia, completely reshaping the country. And here's what that looks like today, or at least back in 2020. Non-Hispanic whites made up 60% of the population, still a clear majority. But the fast growth of Hispanic, Asian American, and other groups has led demographers to talk about this huge tipping point on the horizon, what they call the minority majority. And here's what that's projected to look like. If you follow the current trends, the Census Bureau figures that by around 2045, non-Hispanic whites will actually be less than half of the U.S. population. This is a profound demographic change, and it's going to reshape American politics for generations. This quote from John F. Kennedy really just says it all, doesn't it? America's identity isn't static. It's constantly being shaped and reshaped by all the different people who come here and call it home. So, okay, that's the giant American mosaic. But how does that big picture actually shape our own personal views? Well, that brings us to part two, your political compass. Here, we're zooming in from the national level to the individual to figure out how you forged your beliefs about the political world. The key concept here has a bit of an academic-sounding name, political socialization. But all it really means is the process of how we get our political beliefs. And here's the kicker. Most of this process is totally informal. You don't learn it in a classroom, you just sort of absorb it from the world around you. So where do we absorb it from? Well, think about your own life. The first and usually the most powerful influence is your family, right? You spend years just soaking up your parents' views. Then, as you get older, the mass media often becomes what some have called the new parent, shaping how you see the world. And of course, school plays a big role in teaching national loyalty and basic values, with things like the Pledge of Allegiance. And this whole process usually shapes us into having a political ideology. In America, that typically means identifying as either liberal or conservative. This chart here just breaks down a few of the core differences. Like, on the scope of government, liberals tend to want more regulation to protect the public interest, while conservatives usually favor free market solutions. Or on military spending, conservatives often want to maintain peace through strength, while liberals might argue we should spend less. These are the kinds of frameworks that guide our political debates. Okay, so we have a sense of how individual beliefs get formed. But how do we find out what millions of people are thinking all at the same time? That brings us to part three, polling the public. This is how we zoom out from one person's voice to measure the opinions of the entire country. So how can a poll of just, say, 1,500 people possibly represent over 330 million Americans? It seems crazy, right? Well, the best way to wrap your head around it is the blood test analogy. When you go to the doctor, they don't need to take all of your blood to see what's going on, right? A single tiny sample reveals the properties of the whole batch. A scientific poll works the exact same way. The scientific key, the secret sauce that makes this whole thing work, is called random sampling. The principle is actually really simple, but also super powerful. If every single person in the population has an equal chance of being picked for the survey, then your small sample is going to, statistically speaking, mirror the entire country. That's the magic. Now, polling is a science of estimation. It's not perfect. It's not a crystal ball. That's where this number comes in, plus or minus 3%. This is the typical sampling error. It just means that 95% of the time, the results you see from a poll of about 1,500 people will be within 3 percentage points of what the entire country actually thinks. So it's incredibly accurate. Of course, how we actually do the polling has changed a ton. We went from really expensive door-to-door interviews to randomly dialing landline phones. But today, pollsters are facing this massive challenge because so many people only have cell phones, which are trickier to call. So now, they're moving more and more towards using these representative internet panels to keep up. So, we've got the background, we've got our beliefs, and we know how they're measured. What do we do with it all? Well, that brings us to our final section, Part 4, Making Your Mark. This is all about turning opinion into real-world action. Political scientists basically see two main roads to participation. On one side, you have conventional participation. These are the widely accepted methods we all know, like voting, writing to your elected officials, or donating to a campaign. And on the other side, there's unconventional participation, which is usually more dramatic stuff like protesting, boycotts, or even civil disobedience. You know, when we think of taking political action, our minds usually jump straight to voting. But participation goes so much deeper than that. Look at this. About a third of Americans say they've worked with their neighbors on local problems. Another third have contacted their local government. Millions of us are active in our communities in ways that go way beyond just the ballot box. So, what's the ultimate goal of all this participation? I think this quote just hits the nail on the head. In a representative democracy like ours, our primary job isn't to be an expert on every single policy detail. Our job is to choose the people who will make those decisions for us, and then we hold them accountable. And that really brings our political self-portrait into focus. We've seen the diverse canvas of America, we've sketched out how our beliefs are formed, we've learned how public opinion gets measured, and we've explored the tools we have to take action. So it really all comes down to a simple, personal question. You know how your voice is shaped, and you know how it's measured. The only question left is, how will you choose to use it?